How's it going, guys? Today I'm going to be building the wooden go-kart version 2. If you want to build this go-kart, I do have a free set of plans on my website, woodworkingnut.com, and I have just all the templates, the materials, and all that good stuff included in this, and it's all for free. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, before I get started, I want to address a few things that I know I'll see in the comments if I don't talk about them now. The first thing is that you don't need all these tools to build this project. These are just going to make it a lot easier, but in the end, you really only need like a drill, a circular saw, maybe a grinder, and then a couple basic mechanic hand tools like ratchets and wrenches and stuff like that. So you really don't need all these tools. It'll just make it a lot easier if you have them. The second thing is, instead of using regular pine 2x4s, I'm actually going to be making my own 2x4s out of soft maple. And the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted to use a hardwood, and I love the way that soft maple looks. So let's go ahead and head over to my table saw where I'll start ripping the boards that I have in half, and then I'll mill everything on my planer and joiner. So now I have all my boards ripped in half so they'll fit on my joiner. What I'm gonna do is join one side of the face and one side of the edge, and then I'll go over to my planer and plane the other side to make them parallel with each other. So now that I have all my boards planed down to their final thickness of 1.5 inches, I want to go ahead and cut them to their final width, which is going to be 3.5 inches. So at this point, I have all my boards milled down to what are essentially just maple 2x4s. And if you're buying 2x4s from the store, this is exactly where you're gonna start. So what I did next was I just roughly marked out all my pieces on these boards. And what I can do now is make a bunch of rough cuts. And then after that, I'm gonna dial them in for the final cut. And I'm gonna do that all at my table saw here. So now I have all my pieces rough cut. What I want to do first is go ahead and cut my 6 21-inch pieces. And when I'm making that many repeated cuts at the same length, I like to set up a stop block on my table saw fence. That way I can just go ahead, butt it up, and send it through, and I know they're all going to come out exactly the same. And up next, I'm going to cut 2 pieces at 24 inches, and these are for the engine mounts. Then I'll do 1 piece at 28 inches long, and this is for the front of the frame. Up next, I'm going to do 2 pieces at 80 inches long, and this is for the side frame. Then I want to do one piece at 18 inches long, and this is for the top of the steering column. So now I want to cut the front and back piece for the steering columns, and both of these have a 65-degree angle on one side and the other side's just a regular 90. So let's go ahead and cut one to 16 and 9/16 inches long, and then the other one's going to be 7 and 11/16 inches long. And I know it's kind of a weird measurement, but that's just the way it worked out for these plans. And last but not least, the bottom piece for the steering column is going to have that 65-degree angle on it going parallel with each other on both ends. And that's going to be 15 and 3/8 of an inch long. So at this point, I have all my pieces cut down to their final size. Now a lot of these frame pieces have holes that are going to be drilled in them, and I want to do that before I assemble the frame together, just so I know if I make a mistake, I can just cut a new piece and redo it, rather than having the frame all glued together, and it would be a big nightmare. So I'm going to start by taking a 24-inch piece, and this is going to be one of my engine mounts. What I want to do is cut an 1.5-inch groove in it, and that's going to allow me to set in one of these 1/4-inch pieces of steel, which is going to mount my brake caliper. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my table saw. Now this is one of those things, it's probably going to be the hardest thing to do if you don't have a table saw, but all you do is you take a circular saw, you set it to the 1/4-inch depth, and then you just make multiple passes and you can get the same effect. So it's really not that difficult in the end, but I'm just kind of cheating using a dado set because it makes it a lot quicker. And now with that groove cut on the bottom, I can go ahead and drill out the 2 holes that are going to bolt that metal bar on there. And I realized I probably should have drilled the holes first and then did the groove after. That way if there was any blowout on the bottom, I would have got rid of it when I cut that groove, but hindsight's always 20/20. Now I want to take one of my 21-inch long boards and I'm going to drill a 5/16 inch hole, one on each side and just about 1.5 inches over and 1 inch down. And this is going to allow my throttle and brake cables to pass through. And now I can take 2 more of my 21-inch pieces, and these are going to be for mounting the seat. I'm not going to drill the mounts for the seat yet because I'm going to do that once it's installed, but I am going to drill out a hole 2 inches down from the center on each end of these boards, and this is going to let me bolt my plywood to the underside of the go-kart. So now I can go ahead and focus on the steering column for a second, and I just have it taped together to show you guys. But I have a pillow block, and I'm going to mount one on the back and one on the front, and this is going to allow me to slide my steering shaft through and give me nice and smooth steering. So I'm also going to be drilling 3 holes in the bottom, and they're just going to be a 1/2 inch thick, and that's going to let me bolt my steering column onto my frame. So at this point, I've drilled out all the holes that I can without having the metal pieces made up. So what I'm gonna start working on next is those metal pieces. I'm just gonna be using my drill press here, and I found that using it on the second lowest setting and then using a lot of cutting oil, it really helps me get better results. So I'm gonna go ahead and start drilling out those holes, and then once I'm done with that, I'll go ahead and paint my metal pieces, and then I'll use those as a guide to drill the holes in my wood. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with my piece that mounts my brake caliper. And what I did first was I went ahead and I took my engine piece that I cut that notch in the back on, and I clamped it in place, just making sure it's at a 90-degree angle. And I'm gonna start these holes by hand, just so I know that they line up perfectly, and then I'll do the rest of them after that. And with that drilled, I can now start drilling the brackets that are going to mount the live axle. And up next, I'm gonna drill out my pedal guides, and I actually went through multiple variations of this, so when I paint these up, you'll probably see one of the older variations, but this is gonna be the newest and most current, and I did make a template that's gonna be included that you guys can download if you have the same pedals. It should just make it really easy for the start bolts and the stop bolts, and everything should line up really nice. And last but not least, I want to drill out the two pieces of metal that are going to sandwich together and make the spindles on the front of the go-kart. So with all my metal pieces drilled up, I went ahead and sanded them all nice and smooth and then cleaned them off with mineral spirits. And now I'm gonna go ahead and paint them. And originally I was gonna use primer and paint, but the primer can keeps clogging. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just do straight up paint. And I got this high performance enamel that's gonna be matte black. So I think this will look really good on the metal pieces. So now that we're all caught up to speed on the metal parts, I'm gonna go ahead and start drilling out this front frame piece. And this is probably gonna be one of the trickier parts of this project, just making sure that my top holes line up with my bottom. And when I drilled out these metal pieces, after I drilled one out, I went ahead and took the other one and used it as a template and drilled exactly in the same spot. So I know the holes on the metal are the same, it's just getting it to go through the wood the same. And I'm just gonna use this on top here as kind of a guide, get all my holes started, and then I'll probably finish them up at the drill press. And now I'm just gonna finish it up by hand with my 12-inch long bit. So after absolutely smoking that drill bit, I went ahead and just mocked everything up real quick. and it looks like 4 out of 6 of the bolts go through. These two in the center aren't really lined up enough to the point where I can smack it with a hammer and send it. But I might upsize those holes to like 5/16 just so I can get them through. So that might be the play on that. But the good news is the end bolts do line up perfectly, so I'm pretty happy with that. And this is kind of like the most worried I was about building this thing. So it looks like this should work out just fine, and I'll figure out what to do with this at some point. I'll probably just upsize it. Alright, so now I can start focusing on my side pieces, and I'm going to start with the metal bracket on the back. This is what's going to hold my pillow block to my live axle, and I just want to bolt these through with a 1/2-inch bolt. So I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to start it here on the table, and then I'm going to move over to the drill press to finish it off. And now I just want to do the same thing, but with the pedal guides on the other end. So at this point, I'm almost ready to start assembling the frame. The last thing I want to do is go ahead and take 2 of my 21-inch boards, and originally I was going to butt these together to make a T, but then I decided let's step up my game a little bit and make this a half lap instead. So I ended up cutting a piece to 24.5 inches and making a half lap, and I did that off camera for some reason. I don't know why, but I already got it made up. I just need to go ahead and glue it together. And then this is also going to allow me to go ahead and drill the holes for the 3 steering column bolts that are going to go through. So I'm going to do that. Once I get this glued up and have those holes drilled, I can then start assembling the frame, and we should be off with a wind after that. And just like all my other boards, I went ahead and clamped it up to align it to the bottom, and I'll just use that as a template to drill. And with those last 3 holes drilled, I can now start to assemble the frame. And I'm going to start out with my half lap joint. And for that, I'm just going to be using some Titebond 2 and a couple clamps to hold it in place. Now while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to go ahead and start assembling my steering column. And all these joints on the go-kart are going to be held together by screws, but I am going to be countersinking all of them and pre-drilling them. I'm just not going to show that on camera just to save a little bit of time, but I will be gluing and screwing everything together. And then afterwards, I'm going to be plugging all the screw holes with dowels to help hide them. So unfortunately the frame is just too big to assemble on one of my workbenches, so I gotta work on the ground, so it's not the ideal situation. But I'm gonna do the same thing where I pre-drill everything beforehand, and then I'll glue and screw it on camera. then for your seat brackets and your steering column, you want to shim them up so they're an inch off the ground. And on my top hole here, I'm actually going to use a 2-inch screw. That way I don't have to worry about it going through the pass-through cable for my brake and throttle linkage. So now I got my frame and my steering column screwed and glued together. What I want to do next is go ahead and hide these screw holes a little bit, and I'll do that just by taking some wood plugs and a dab of wood glue, and I'll put one in each of the screw holes. And then once that dries, I'll take a flush cut saw, I'll trim the head of the plug off, and then I'll sand it down to a nice smooth finish with some sandpaper. And that's not going to make the hole totally invisible, but it is going to help hide those screw holes a little bit, and it'll just give it a nicer overall look. So I'll go ahead and show you guys how to do that on the steering column here, and then I'll do the rest of the frame off camera just to save a little bit of time. So I just want to go ahead and put a dab of glue in each screw hole. And then I can go ahead and take a plug and set it in place. And then I'll just use a hammer and tap it in. And now that the glue is dried, I can go ahead and take a flush cut saw and cut the end of the plugs off. And last but not least, I want to hit it with some sandpaper just to smooth it out. So you just want to rinse and repeat that process for the rest of the plugs, and I'll do that off camera to save some time. But what I want to do next is go ahead and head over to my table saw and cut my 3/4 inch sheet of plywood to size. So I can go ahead and set that plywood sheet to the side for now. First, I want to go ahead and drill the holes for my seat to mount, and then drill the holes for my engine to mount. And I have a template for both of those. This is the one for the seat, and basically I'm just going to put it on there, tape it in place, center punch it, and then I'll drill my holes from there. So let's go ahead and do that for the seat and the engine. And now I went ahead and put my plywood sheet into position. What I want to do next is go ahead and transfer the holes from my frame onto my plywood sheet. So I'm just going to use this as a template and drill straight through. So now with those holes drilled in my plywood, I can go ahead and start sanding all my pieces down to a nice smooth finish. So after doing a lot of sanding, I can now apply the finish, and for that I'm just going to use some wipe-on polyurethane. Alright, so the big day is here. It's final assembly day on the wood go-kart, and I'm going to start by bolting my sheet of plywood down to the frame. And this is just going to be 4 3/8 inch bolts that are 3 inches long. And I can lock them in place with a washer and a lock nut on each one. And while I have it flipped up, I'm going to go ahead and mount my seat, and for that I'm going to use 4 1/4 inch bolts that are 3.5 inches long. And the last thing I want to do before I flip it back down is go ahead and bolt my steering column on. And for that, I'm going to be using 4 1/2 inch bolts that are 4.5 inches long. And honestly, I'd probably bump these all up to a 5-inch bolt, but I don't have any on me right now, so I'm just going to go with it. So up next, I'm going to mount my bars that are going to make up my spindle brackets, and for that I'm going to use a 1/4 inch bolt that's 4.5 inches long going across the top. I should be able to get all 6 in, but we'll see what happens. I don't think these two are going to make it. So now I'm gonna go ahead and mount my pillow blocks, and for that, originally I was gonna use 1/2" bolts, but they're just a little bit too big to go through my pillow block, so I had to go metric on us. So I picked out a 12 mil bolt that's 70 mil long. And now I can go ahead and slide my steering shaft through, and make sure you have a locking collar on each side when you do this. And up top here, I want to leave as little room as possible, so that's exactly what I did, and I can lock these locking collars in place. And with the shaft in place now, I can go ahead and take a 5/16 inch bolt that's 3.5 inches long and slide it through the end here. And this part's unfortunately a little bit too high, so instead I'm just gonna go below it, and that's why I'm using this longer bolt. So I'm gonna lock this in place with the lock nut. And now I can go ahead and take my tie rod for the left side and put that on. Now one thing to note is this is a 5/16 inch bolt, but this is a 3/8 inch tie rod. So I just have a little bushing that's gonna go in there and make it fit nice and snug. And then I'm gonna thread on a 5/16 inch nut just to act as a spacer. And then I wanna do the same thing and put my tie rod on for the right side. And I'll finish it off with the lock nut. And now I can put my spindle on. Now I only have a 4.5 inch bolt, and really it should probably be about a 5 inch one. So I'll adjust the plans for that, and just know in the future I'm gonna change this out. And I'm gonna put 1 washer on the bottom, and then I'll have 8 up top. And to connect my tie rod to my spindle, I have a 3/8 inch bolt that's 1 3/4 inches long, and I'm just gonna drop it through. And then I have a 1/4 inch thick spacer, and then I'll go ahead and drop that all through. And I'll finish it with the washer and a lock nut. And then you can go in and slide your wheel on, and I do have a 1.5 inch spacer on here. And then I'll put the lock nut on, and I'll wait to torque this until it's on the ground. Now before I connected these tie rods off camera, I did a lot of adjusting to get it relatively close, and now with my tires on, I can just fine tune these by turning them and adjust the toe in and toe out to make sure everything is pretty much as straight as possible. And I've temporarily put the steering wheel on just so I can line everything up with where I want it. And once you're happy with your alignment, you can go ahead and lock your jam nut into place. And you do want to make sure that you have enough thread going into the actual tie rod itself, so just keep that in mind. So now I can go ahead and put my steering wheel on, and I did already put the hub on for it, and it's just 3 bolts and 3 cotter pins. So then I just want to line it up. And then I'll secure it in place with a washer and a castellated nut that's gonna have a cotter pin. So now I'm gonna focus on the back half of the go-kart, and the first thing I'm gonna do is go ahead and take my metal mounts and bolt these on, and that's gonna be 1/2-inch bolts that are 3 inches long. So after putting these through, I realized I'm not gonna be able to get my pillow block mounted because the bolt's now gonna be blocked. So I actually wanna back these off a little bit, mount my pillow block, and then finish putting these in. And for my pillow blocks, they're just gonna be 2-inch bolts. And now I can finish installing the bracket. So I actually went ahead and loosened the nuts that hold the pillow blocks in place just a little bit so they can slide back and forth. So that way when I gotta put my live axle in, it won't get hung up on anything, and then I'll tighten it afterwards. But what I wanna do next is go ahead and install the bar that's gonna hold my brake. And for that, I have 2 bolts that are just 5/16 of an inch at 2 inches long. And then I'll use 2 1.5-inch long 5/16 bolts to mount my brake bracket. And now I can slide my brake caliper into place. So I went ahead and clamped my brake disc into the caliper, so that way when I slide my axle through and I'm slipping my locking collars in, I don't have to worry about holding it up in place. It's just gonna be held by the caliper. So let's go ahead and slide the axle through, and you wanna make sure that you put all your locking collars and all that on as you're going. And then I'm gonna have the sprocket on the inside as well. My key stock into position. And slide my tire on. And just like the front wheels, I'll just put this on by hand for now, and then once it's on the ground, I'll fully torque it. And at this point, I can go ahead and set it on the ground before it gets too heavy where I can't pick it up by myself. And now I can torque the wheels down. So now what I want to do is go ahead, and I never drilled a 1/4" hole for this brake bar to go through because I wasn't sure if it was going to be positioned properly, so I was waiting. But everything looks like it's lining up good, so I can go ahead and drill that and drop a bolt through. And now I can drop in a 4.5 inch long 1/4" inch bolt with the washer on each side and a lock nut on the bottom. So at this point I'm getting prepped and ready to mount the engine. Now what I want to do first is go ahead and bolt on this riser plate, and I have this because my engine has a torque converter installed on it. And if you haven't seen it already, I made a video about the engine I'm putting on it. It's just a Predator 212, but I added a stage 1 kit to it, so hopefully it's making about 2 or 3 more horsepower than normal. And one more thing I want to mention about this is all the reviews said that the rib nuts that were installed on it were just cheap and they would strip out really easy and whatnot. So I went ahead and just drilled those out ahead of time, and I'm just going to be running bolts straight through mine, so I don't even have to worry about that. And with that riser block in place, I can now go ahead and bring the engine over. And I just want to point out that I am using some rubber mounts just to help reduce vibration from the engine into the go-kart frame. So just real quick from the future here, I actually went ahead and didn't use the rubber mounts because they ended up causing me more trouble than what it was worth. So I just went ahead and replaced those with 5/16 inch bolts that are 1.5 inches long. Now before I torque the bolts that mount the engine, I want to go ahead and cut my chain to the right size. That way I can get that all lined up and push it forward if need be, and then I'll tighten the engine in place. I messed up. So I accidentally cut the chain 1 link too short, so I gotta wait for the new one to come in. But in the meantime, I'm gonna show you guys how to set up the pedals. So I'm gonna start by taking a 1/4 inch bolt that's 1 3/4 inches long, and I'm gonna feed it through my pedal on the side here. And then I can go ahead and add my return spring. And then what I wanna do is go ahead and put a washer on. And then I'm just gonna slip a regular nut down there just to kind of act as a spacer. And then I want to put another washer on. And then I can go ahead and slide my clevis on. And then I'll put a washer on the outside and finish it off with a lock nut. And you want to make sure you don't lock this down too tight, otherwise it won't be able to rotate freely. So now I can take my pedal guide and put it in place, and all my bolts are 5/16 of an inch for this. So what I want to do is take my first bolt, which is 4.5 inches long with a washer on the end, and slide it through. And this is the bolt that's going to hold my pedal. So what I want to do is go ahead and put another washer on. and then run a lock nut all the way down. And I'll just temporarily put this bolt in to hold it in place. And before I fully tighten this, I'm gonna go ahead and build up the rest of my stack. So I'm just gonna add another washer, and then I have a 1-inch spacer. And then I can go ahead and put my pedal in position, and using a ratchet, I'll spin the whole bolt just to thread it on. And now I can go ahead and tighten that lock nut. And then I can put a washer on the outside and finish it off with another lock nut. And once again, make sure it's not too tight, otherwise your pedal won't spin freely. And then I can take a 4-inch bolt and feed it through this back hole. And I'll put my washer on right now. And then I'll put a lock nut on as well. And I'll slowly work that until it's all the way over and holding the spring. This is gonna work as a hold for my spring and the full travel stop. And then I wanna add another 4-inch bolt, and this is gonna be the forward stop. And I'll slide my washer on and a lock nut. And then I'll add a 3.5-inch bolt in the front. And then I can line the stainless steel bracket up with my clevis. That way my cable can go through there nice and smooth. And originally I was gonna drill just a hole through this bolt, but it's a little bit too low, so I had to go ahead and get a bracket since this is a little bit taller. So with my pedals installed, I can go ahead and start setting up the brake and throttle cables. So I'll go ahead and start with the brake. So originally I was gonna have a bolt just run through this arm, and then I'd have a hole drilled in the bolt, and that would go up and down. But that's not gonna work out because the bolt would actually be hitting the rotor. So that's something that I didn't really plan on. So what I did was I made a little extension, and this is basically gonna extend the arm. That way I can put the bolt a little bit further back. And then I went ahead and picked up this 3/8" universal clevis pin, and I'll just slide that through the back. Now I do have to use some washers to get the spacing on it right. And then I can just go ahead and slide a cotter pin through. And with that longer arm on there, I'm actually gonna drill a new 3/32 inch hole just a little bit further back so it lines up better. And now I can go ahead and run the casing for the brake cable. And now I can go ahead and feed my inner wire through. And this cable is all actually cut to size, so I'm just gonna add this little barrel on the end to hold it in place. And I might add another one since this is the brake and I don't want anything to happen. And on the back, I'll just route the cable through, and I got a lot of extra right now. I just gotta cut it off once I'm done. And then I'll go ahead and add a 3-inch return spring just to help that lever come down. And originally I didn't do that, so you'll probably see some footage of it without the spring. And I'll add another one on the back just to be safe. And I'll throw a zip tie around here just to keep it away from my torque converter. So we can go ahead and use the same process and do the throttle. So picking where we left off with the engine, the new chain is here and I already cut it to size. Now I just want to go ahead and install the master link. And when you put this clip on, the open end, you want it facing the opposite way of the engine. So when it's going, it doesn't have the chance of accidentally hitting it and knocking it off somehow. So I always like to have the back facing that way. That way I don't have to worry about it. And now I can go ahead and put my key stock in and slide that into place. And now I can lock the set screws on my sprocket and the locking collars. And now I can go ahead and lock my engine mounts down. So that's gonna be a wrap for the wooden go-kart version 2. I gotta say, having the steering wheel is way better than the original feet design I had in my first one, and then hitting over 40 miles an hour on this was my first big goal when I set out to build this. So I'm extremely happy with the way this came out. And let me know if you want to see a video on potentially doing like a stage 2 or stage 3 kit on this engine, because I would like to see how fast I can really make this thing go. So let me know if you guys are interested in that. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, hit that share button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I am trying to make a push for 100K, so I would greatly appreciate everyone that does. So that's going to be a wrap for this one, and I got a lot more projects coming in the future. So as always, I'll see you guys next time.